There are some conditions where women have left the workforce because of childcare needs, of the ones they can't afford, they don't have the ability to pay, and because of fears of going into companies or industries or jobs where they fear that there are not the conditions to be safe.
A record number of workers in the United States are quitting their jobs. We take a look at what's being dubbed the Great Resignation and what it means for the American economy. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. A record-breaking 4.3 million people in the United States have quit their jobs in the month of August alone, according to data released by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's 2.9% of the total workforce. The month before that, 4.1 million workers resigned. These are the highest numbers ever reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Experts who've called this, quote, the Great Resignation, say people are leaving their jobs because workers across the U.S. are demanding better pay and working conditions as well as more flexibility in their daily lives. A new poll found that since the COVID-19 pandemic began, 91% of Americans want to do at least some of their work from home. States such as Kentucky, Idaho, South Dakota, and Iowa have the highest rates of workers quitting their jobs. They also have higher rates of new COVID-19 infections. So what are the driving forces behind the Great Resignation? We will explore this phenomenon with Professor of Economics at the University of California at Berkeley, Ulrike Malmendier, and former U.S. Congressman and presidential candidate Dennis Kucinich. But first, I'm joined by Alicia Bowen, one of the millions of Americans who decided to leave their jobs. Alicia Bowen, why did you decide, after spending 8 years in your old job working for a commercial cleaning company, that you'd had enough, that it was time to quit?
The pay was very, very low and the treatment was terrible. We weren't appreciated. I wasn't given time off when I really needed it. It was just a miserable place to be, and I needed it to end.
And you needed it to end, so you decided to leave, even though you did not have another job lined up.
Yes, I was at my wit's end and I could not take any more. I had thought about it for a long time, and I was in too much of a bad headspace to continue while trying to find another job.
You weren't being appreciated or valued. You weren't being paid enough, and you weren't given the flexibility that you needed.
That's right.
What kind of flexibility were you looking for that they didn't provide you with?
Time off for family emergencies, mostly that, because I do have a family and they get sick sometimes and I have to stay home with them, and they weren't having that. They didn't want to give me even a day off because it was inconvenient for them.
And so when you lost your husband a few years ago,
Yeah.
Did you get time off?
No, the employer actually was very angry and told me that it was very inconvenient for him, and he demanded the keys and everything back, as if he was going to fire me, but he still needed me. He didn't fire me. He just threatened to.
And yet you decided to stay for a few years. What made you feel this time that it was enough, that it was time to leave?
It was messing my headspace up. I was grumpy coming home and bringing home my work attitude home, and it wasn't good for the kids. They were unhappy because they knew I was unhappy, and it just needed to stop. It was too miserable. It wasn't worth it at all.
And it wasn't worth the money you were being paid. You were being paid less than $13. You were being paid something like $12.50 an hour, which is more than the federal minimum wage, which is only $7.25, but much less than the living wage in the area in which you live in Ohio.
Correct.
You had zero benefits as well.
Okay.
What do you think needs to change in the system for people to start making a dignified living in the United States?
The wages need to go up with the cost of living. I don't remember all of the statistics or data, but I do remember reading recently that the wages are significantly lower than the cost of living and haven't changed in at least 20 years or so.
But they haven't changed since 2009. If you were able to just say one thing to the congressman who represents your area, or the congresswoman, what would it be?
Make a plan to encourage employers or an incentive of some sort to try to get these wages up, and I'll be voting for it.
All right, Alicia Bowen, I'm glad you were able to find another job in which you seem obviously to be far happier and more valued. Thank you so much for being with us, Alicia Bowen, and for sharing your story.
Thank you for letting me share my story.
Alicia is one of the 25 million people who left their jobs in the first 7 months of this year. So what is driving this mass job exodus out of the workforce? And what does it mean for the future of the American labor force and productivity? To discuss, I'm joined by Professor of Finance and Economics, Ulrike Malmendier. Professor Malmendier, much of your work focuses on behavioral economics. What do you attribute this new phenomenon of people leaving their jobs in such historic numbers to? Is the pandemic having the behavioral effect that you expected to see? Because it does look a little bit counterintuitive to see so many people leave.
Yes, indeed, Ghida, it does. I think it's not anything like what we economists expected. I have to admit, including me, but thinking about what's going on right now, I think we are at a moment where we're still not 100% sure what to attribute it to. There are several factors. One are traditional ones, and I do just want to mention them, like with people having to change their job situation, losing their job, encountering, putting themselves into different living situation or life, children, work situation. Readjustment is just a little bit costly. There's some frictions. And I think we have to see 6 months out still, also when financial resources get tighter, how people will be behaving at that point in time. Having said that, you are hinting at what my research interest is and what I think is an important factor, which is that living through a big event such as the pandemic, or you can think about other crises like financial crisis as well, changes us. It changes our attitudes towards work, our values, how we weigh work against other values in life. And I do think that plays a role.
There's no doubt, as you say, it has really put things in perspective for a lot of us. And this whole work-life balance. There's also burnout, of course. There's less willingness to endure. But is there something also more existential? Because it has changed the way we fundamentally view ourselves and our lives. Even those who you wouldn't think have the luxury to quit are leaving their jobs.
Yes, exactly. So the problem for many traditional economic approaches to trying to assess the situation is that traditional models, both in academia and in the real world, in policy, do not allow for us to change as the result of an experience, right? We might have preferences to work more or work less, spend more time with our family, spend less. But whatever we are, that's how we walk through life, is the assumption many policymakers and economists make. And I instead strongly believe that living through an experience like the pandemic makes us realize what can happen to our work situation, to our life situation, makes us look at values differently. And in particular, things that were more of a negative experience, even if they're not present anymore, will stay with us. Our brain is now wired to think about them frequently. And if those are related to work circumstances, work stress, they will keep coming up, even if the work situation is pre-pandemic again.
Yeah, and you mentioned the impact of a huge event that everyone has lived through, such as the pandemic. But you've also studied the impact of personal and generational experiences on economic decisions and behaviors that people have. For example, growing up in Germany, you say that the experiences of hyperinflations of the early 20th century has shaped generations of Germans. How do you think will this pandemic shape this and the next generations of workers everywhere in the world, because it is happening in China, in Asia, in parts of Europe, this so-called Great Resignation that we're seeing.
Yes, indeed. And what I've observed in my previous research is that the way crises, pandemics, epidemics shape us in the US, in Germany, all over the world, as you say, tends to be highly domain specific, as we call it. So what I mean with that is that, you know, if traditional models allow for any impact of a crisis experience on our attitudes and beliefs, we tend to think, oh, that made us more risk averse. We're now going to go for safety. Well, that's actually not true. It's very specific to the type of experience you've had. So living through, for example, the Great Depression here in the US, when stock markets crashed, etc., made those generations, the so-called depression babies, highly averse to ever investing their money in the stock market. But it doesn't necessarily say anything about their bond market investment, to take even a very close decision. Same for other crises where maybe unemployment was particularly affected, etc. Now, that means, for your question, it really depends on the presentation of the crisis in that country. And given that different countries have different social support networks and different impacts on financial markets were observed, it will be different, actually. So here in the US, stock market did actually pretty great throughout the whole crisis. So I don't expect people to shy away from perceived to be risky financial investment. But in Spain, for example, at least for some months, it looked quite differently. There was both the effect on employment and on the stock market. So there I would expect a dual impact. So how governments handled it, how much safety, security they gave people will have a huge impact, is my prediction, on the long-term implications on how it changes us.
And of course, it also has had an impact on people deciding to take early retirement. In this country, in the United States, 3 million Americans retired early because of COVID. If the pandemic has taught us one thing about workers and employers, what was it? How has it shifted the dynamics between the two? And will we ever go back to the status quo ante?
Yeah, excellent question. So this experience of working through the pandemic has, for many people, been a negative experience. There's some silver lining, some, teleworking improvements, etc. But by and large, a lot of people connected, as you said, to burnout, to stressors, to staring at a screen all day long. So your brain, in my mind, got rewired to connect work with more negative experience or have the more negative aspects more upfront. And that will stay with you. So even if you reestablish exactly the same work conditions you had pre-pandemic, your brain will quickly access those memories and then highlight the negative experiences. Now, that is a change that doesn't go away, even if we were perfectly back to pre-COVID. And employers should take that into account. They have different employees now, those which have more open eyes to the negative aspects, the long hours, the stressors of their work. And it is not ingrained in a way that it could never change, but it will slowly change. It may be 10, 20, 30 years until you have your pre-pandemic employee back. So my message for employers is the earlier you are fully aware that you have an employee which has been scarred, which is now having these negative experiences carrying around with her or him, and you try to accommodate it. You try to give particularly positive experience, that you're particularly willing to give accommodations and be generous in providing flexibility that is needed or providing interesting work content, the better for you. Because that is the workforce you are dealing with right now. And I actually, for one, as an European, very much applaud that, if I may add.
One of the many evolving legacies of the pandemic, Professor Ulrike Malmendier, thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Now, with so many Americans resigning their work positions for better working conditions and compensation, have labor laws failed the American worker? I'm joined by former U.S. Representative from the state of Ohio, Dennis Kucinich. He's a former mayor of Cleveland and Democratic presidential candidate in 2004 and 2008. Congressman Kucinich, we heard a little earlier from Alicia Bowen. She's a low-income worker from your state, Ohio, who was forced to quit her job, like millions of American workers who are leaving because of low pay, because of the lack of social and economic benefits and flexibility. Now, Democrats in Congress are trying to change some of that by asking for paid leave. They went from 12 weeks to 4. But realistically, though, what can American workers hope for given the political reality and the congressional wrangling that we see?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to understand there's a symbiotic relationship necessarily between those who are working and those who are the owners of the business, except in the case of government employees. And that means that today, with plentiful job openings, there's about 11 million job openings right now in the United States. Workers can determine better what their wage levels will be, what their benefits would be. Childcare, healthcare are principal among those, paid leave. And Congress has to take note of that as a way of helping all businesses, but certainly those businesses which have not been attuned to the needs of their workers in this important way are finding that in this particular market, it's very difficult to be able to get the quality employees that they want, because people are demanding more from their work.
People are demanding more. In a way, they're flexing their bargaining power. They have less tolerance than they used to. They have, as you say, more options. You've always been one of the more labor-friendly members of Congress. You served on the Committee on Education and the Workforce, as well as the Subcommittee on Workforce Protections during your time in Congress. When you look at what is going on there now, how do you keep American workers from quitting their jobs if there are no new social safety net programs that Congress can agree to, especially those at lower incomes?
Well, you point out something, Ghida, that needs to be inspected very carefully, and that is the rights of workers. Unions today across America are in a much stronger bargaining position, and you see strikes or the threat of strikes with some very large labor unions like the UAW at John Deere, Kaiser's healthcare workers, the United Food and Commercial Workers have many job sites that right now are being challenged as to working conditions. And so what we have is a period right now where workers are demanding the right to organize, the right to collective bargaining, the right to strike, the right to decent wages and benefits, the right to a secure retirement. These are all consistent but more strongly affirmed principles that workers are finding themselves in a stronger position to assert.
And these are many of the principles that progressives in Congress are fighting for. You once served as chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, in fact, taking over from Bernie Sanders, who tweeted just this week that it is time the United States ended what he called that international embarrassment of being the only country among developed nations that does not have guaranteed paid family and medical leave. More than 100 House Democrats wrote to President Biden this week saying that paid leave is a top priority for Democrats and the workers they represent. But how much leverage do they really have?
Well, the leverage is twofold. First of all, this is very popular among the American people. But secondly, employers are not waiting for the government and are finding that it's important to have these kind of benefits available in order to attract workers. You know, remember, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we've seen about 4.3 million people leave their jobs in the month of August. The Harvard Business Review recently stated that the greatest movement is among mid-career employees. And so people who are familiar with the workplace, but they're no longer tolerating not getting the kind of help they need, which makes work enjoyable, which makes it productive for them personally. You know, in America.
How sustainable is it that in the richest country in the world, this is the situation?
Well, you know, there's an ethic where Americans live to work. In many countries, people work to live. And that kind of philosophy really imposes a type of drudgery in everyday life. You just got to go in there and do your job. Or today, if people are at home, they still have to produce. And the inability to be able to not just enjoy the fruits of one's labor, but to be able to have a life that doesn't feel like you're on a treadmill is suddenly being put up to a challenge because of the pandemic, because people are all of a sudden finding themselves being able to pick and choose who they want to work for, where they want to work, what the circumstances are of their work. And we're seeing a shift occur in America, absolutely.
And Democrats themselves have been arguing that the United States is one of the worst countries in the world at providing the strong, consistent benefits that workers need. One of the crucial issues for people taking jobs, even keeping their jobs, is affordable housing, as you know. I wonder how your own personal experience growing up in Ohio, the oldest of 7 children, constantly moving homes and being tasked with the responsibility of finding affordable apartments growing up, shaped your understanding of this problem.
Well, it's certainly something that was seared into my memory, my experience, and my advocacy once I became mayor of the city and also a member of the United States Congress later on. You know, we have to remember that those particularly who are having trouble making ends meet, and that still is happening in our economy. There is in a sense, a false sense of security that our country has right now. The bottom, I feel, could fall out almost at any time with the realization that so many people are having trouble making ends meet, paying the rent, being able to pay their mortgage, and you know, they don't have the kind of protection in our economy that other countries have. So, you know, America is going through some economic changes as a result of the pandemic. The government's policy and the Fed's policy of quantitative easing are not likely to be able to solve the more structural problems in the American economy that deal with these issues of productive work and of work that helps to create a sense of spirit of a nation.
Sure. No, when you speak about fixing the structural problems, how important is it to raise the federal minimum wage in the U.S., which is still at $7.25? It hasn't been adjusted for inflation since 2009, and it is the lowest minimum wage among developed nations. The Democrats' goal is $15 per hour by 2025. Will that happen? How important is it?
We should, yes, Ghida, and we should already be there, but we aren't. Now, what's happening in the marketplace as a result of the tremendous number of job openings that are occurring is that it's not unusual for employers to offer more than $15 an hour to be able to attract workers. That's happening all over the country. So in some ways, the private sector is taking a cue from the realities of the marketplace, and no surprise, our political system often lags behind those marketplace realities, and when it takes action, may find that the private sector has already worked it out.
Former Congressman Dennis Kucinich, great to have you on the program. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
To state the obvious, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected us all, the world over. It forced us to reflect on the way we would like to lead our lives, especially in more affluent societies. Although the global economy underwent significant stresses and shocks over the last 20 months, it has not crashed. And yet, in the United States, a surprising epiphenomenon is emerging. Millions are quitting their jobs, the very same jobs they were scared they might live to lose with COVID-19, when lockdowns became a norm. Economists and behavioral scientists have their work cut out. In the United States, the cost of labor and social protection, or lack thereof, has always been polarizing. The US is at the bottom of OECD countries when it comes to the national minimum wage, just $7.25 per hour. Today, it would have been $20 if indexed to inflation, $26 if indexed to productivity. So in short, US lawmakers who are in a perpetual state of electoral mode are in a bind. Raise the federal minimum wage and lose on productivity and profits and international competitiveness, or keep the price of labor low, exploitatively low, with no entitlement to benefits like paid medical or maternity leave, and see more Americans exit the workforce. That is why America, even Trump's America, might even make peace with illegal migration to keep the economy oiled, wages low, and let profits flow. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team. We'll see you next time for another look inside America. Till then, thanks for watching.